This is VikesNow, and I am Dustin Baker back Tuesday, July 5th, in the dry part of the summer for NFL content. Accordingly, CBS Sports yesterday pumped out an analysis, an extensive piece about the best teams per team in franchise history. And they had on like the 96 Packers and all of these teams that won a Super Bowl. And because the Vikings never won a Super Bowl, there wasn't an obvious standout. And there's four losing teams of Super Bowls: 67, 73, 74, and 1976. But Brian Diardo of CBS Sports says that the 1998 team, which you're probably familiar with, is the tops of all time for the Vikings. He also called them the greatest team to not reach a Super Bowl, which is probably true. It's easy for a Vikings fan to say that and just be like, oh yeah, 98 Vikings. But when you go through the teams that didn't reach the big game, there's probably none better than the 98 Vikings. So we'll get that out of the way. We agree on that. The 1998 Vikings and that Olympic-like offense was probably the best squad to never reach a Super Bowl. However, I'm having this show today because contrary to popular belief, the 98 Vikings, by the numbers, are not the best Vikings team in franchise history. I think in the CBS article, subconsciously there was a bias toward teams that were in existence during that guy's lifetime, ones that he'd seen and could use his eye test to say, like, oh yeah, 98 Vikings, they beat the rest of them. So that's fair, I get it. But by history, by the numbers, the 1969 Vikings are the cream of the crop. And unsurprisingly, I have a multitude of reasons that we're going to go through. But you keep in mind, you can have different areas. 1998 Vikings were my favorite team. That was my third season cheering for the franchise. It got me hooked like none other to football in general. You can point to the 98 season or any season of your choosing, 2009, and say, like, this is the best because of nostalgia, where I was in my life, and that's perfectly fine. So this isn't to sit on YouTube and tell you the 98 season was trashy or that it wasn't the most exciting, because it was, especially for most of the folks watching this show or on Viking social media. So we can have agreement there that there are different tiers. 98 could be your favorite, but in terms of the best team, it's the 69 bunch. So foremost, out of the gate, the 1969 Vikings led by Joe Cap and the Purple People Eaters creeping on a come-up: Carl Eller, Alan Page, Jim Marshall, Paul Krause. They were a more balanced team than the 98 team. So the 98 team certainly wasn't poor on defense. They ranked 6th in points allowed. But they were a top-heavy offensive organization. They just outscored everybody, which was perfectly acceptable. But the defense on the 98 team couldn't hold a candle to the 1969 team. So in 1998, the Vikings, unsurprisingly again, ranked first in points scored, and then 6th in points allowed. So if you use that as a reliable metric for defense, first on offense, 6th best on defense, which is great, which is why they finished 15-1. However, the 1969 team ranked first in points scored, first in points allowed. They were perfectly balanced at the top of the league. That's why they went 12-2. And so just based on the numbers alone, the defense, especially at that time when defense really meant something, Zimmer should have been alive back then, being a head coach, because that's really when defense mattered. Teams didn't throw all that much. It was about running the football. But I think according to the balance on both offense and defense, the 69 team takes the cake. It's probably why they got to the Super Bowl. The 98 team did not. But in terms of 98's offense, leaps and bounds better than Joe Cap and Gene Washington and friends. However, go look at the 98 roster for the Vikings defense, which wasn't bad at all, but it didn't have the Purple People Eaters. So I'm going with the balance for the 69 team superseding the 98 team. Secondarily, the margin of victory. So you were probably alive watching the 98 Vikings for those 4 months, 5 months, 4 months. And it felt like they beat everybody's ass, because they did. The 1998 Vikings defeated opponents by an average of 16.3 points. Where does that number come from? points scored versus points allowed divided by 16 games at the time. The average margin of victory overall, generally speaking, for all 16 games was 16.3 points. Untoppable, right? Wrong. The 1969 Vikings outscored opponents by 17.6 points, the most in franchise history. So I challenge you to go just Google 1969 Minnesota Vikings, and you'll see their schedule, and you'll see how they beat the piss out of teams more so than the 98 team beat the piss out of others. It's hard to believe because you probably weren't alive then, but it happened. Chiefly, it was the ability to stifle opposing teams on defense, keeping them to goose eggs in certain games or to 3 points while running up the score to, there's one game that's like 51-3, and there's just multiple ass kickings on the 1969 team that fly under the radar because a lot of the folks weren't alive then or were kids that follow this stuff today. So by the margin of victory, it's unbelievable that there could be a team that outscored teams more so than the 98 team, but this 1969 squad did indeed do it. All right, so here's the biggest kicker of them all, and I invite debate on this because here's what you're looking at. The 1998 team lost an NFC championship. They didn't get to the Super Bowl. So how on earth could you classify 4 other Vikings teams that actually were good enough to get to the Super Bowl in the championship game of their conference? They had the cojones to win it. How could arguably any of those 4 teams, Vikings teams that lost, outrank the 98 Vikings? Because as a team sport, when the game was on the line on that January 1999 day, the 98 team couldn't get it done. The 1969 team could, of course, lost to the Chiefs a week later, 23-7. But I think if you're using a simple litmus test, did the team get to the Super Bowl? Yes or no? That arguably cast the 98 team down to number 5 in the annals of Vikings history because, let's face it, they didn't reach the Super Bowl, and that's a big damn deal. So I know it gets dicey if you want to say that the 1973 team, 1974, 1976 teams are better than 98. Probably not. And then you always get into the odd territory, too, about, like, ranking these compared to era. So if you took the 2021 Vikings in a time machine and faced them against the 69 Vikings, 21 teams probably going to eat their lunch because just athleticism, how it's evolved over these 50 years. But I would make a strong argument that if the 98 team couldn't reach the Super Bowl, why on earth are they the best team? Because you enjoyed watching them, because Randy Moss had 17 touchdowns in the first year. That's all fine and dandy, but per tiered rankings, they can't be number 1. They didn't even get to the Super Bowl. Didn't get a chance to lose it. So that's why I'll stick with 69 emphatically over 98. And I wasn't alive for the 69. I was born in 1983. So I was in living color for the 98 season. And I have every reason to pound the table for 98 being better, but simply, objectively, it ain't. Let's see. I think that is the case. Just remember the favorite versus best argument. Those can be 2 very distinct things. I think on the whole, I was trying to dig into this before the show. The 69 team, Joe Kapp was quarterback. He wasn't crazy dynamic. He had 19 touchdowns in that season, which was a lot back then. And on offense, the playmakers weren't too scintillating. I think Bill Brown was on that team, and I already mentioned Gene Washington. So they didn't have, the Jim Brown or Lynn Swann, like the big names of that era on offense. So I think comparatively, if you want to understand what the 69 Vikings were, it was kind of like the 2002 Tampa Bay Buccaneers, who had Brad Johnson at quarterback, Michael Pittman at running back, Keenan McCardell, who was a coach for the Vikings, at wide receiver. And then that defense was just rip-roaring, absolutely fabulous with Rondé Barber, Sapp, Derek Brooks, just a plethora of defensive talent. So that one you probably were around for, perhaps you were a kid, but a bedfellow of the 69 Vikings structurally, how they were built, would probably be the 2002 Buccaneers, who finished 12-4, were the 1 seed, and then decimated the Raiders in the Super Bowl. So it's great. If you want to say the Vikings, 98 Vikings are the best of all time, there's not too many folks that are going to chin check you on that. But by the numbers, the 1969 team was a more complete product and hence reached the Super Bowl. I'll be back with Josh Fry tomorrow. We had him on a week ago or 2 weeks ago. I think about 2 weeks ago. I'm going to ask him to predict the top 8 Vikings players for the 2022 season based on how he believes they will perform. For the purposes of this episode, I don't care about what they did last year. I want to know their input, upcoming, his forecast. And we'll be back tomorrow afternoon with that. And Skol, baby.